Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be a part 2 to the Torath Mosheh Orthodox Jews strict observance video. Now, as you'll remember in the last video, I dealt with a problematic statement, that statement being something that someone posted once that says Orthodox Jews are those Jews who perceive themselves to be the authentic continuation of the Jewish tradition, as opposed to the Reform and conservative movements, which are considered by them to be deviants. They, meaning Orthodox Jews, are the most traditional amongst the Jews and espouse strict adherence to Jewish law. So as you remember in the last video, I mentioned that this is a problematic statement for several reasons that I noted in the previous video. And in this video, we're going to give some examples to deal with this issue and determine whether or not this is really true, that it's just a matter of Orthodox Jews perceiving themselves to be the authentic continuation of Jewish tradition, and whether they just are espousing a strict adherence to Jewish law, as if it's like they're just being weird by being strict, or or that strict is some strange thing, and the adherence to Jewish law the way that Orthodox are doing is something strange or not normal. Now, again, if you remember the previous video, I also dealt with the idea of saying, okay, well, that would be like someone saying that, by following the rules and work procedures that most jobs have, that you're doing something strange. You're simply, you perceive yourself to be doing the work correctly, when in reality, you're using the normal processes and procedures that already exist to do the work as you're supposed to do it. And that's just considered to be an immoral imperative of doing work for any company. Here. Let's deal exactly when we describe the actual actions that an Orthodox Jew takes, or Torath Mosheh Jews, the term I usually use. But Orthodox Jew is perfectly fine, even though it mainly describes Jews from Europe and the traditions of Jews from Europe who keep the Torah as it's always been kept. Let's take a look and see what sources we're talking about in terms of determining what practice they actually do with relation to what we're going to talk about in this video. Now, again, it's important to note that, the term I always use is Torath Mosheh. Now, Orthodox Jews, as I've mentioned in previous videos, are a type of Torath Mosheh that usually denotes Jews from European extractions who continue to keep the Torah as it had been traditionally passed down throughout Jewish communities. And if you take an Orthodox Jew and place them next to, let's say, a Jew from Yemen, where there were no movements like the conservative or reform or anything like that, or humanistic, you would see that Orthodox and Yemenite Jews practice were the same thing in terms of the Torah that had been passed down through the generations. The same with Sephardic Jews, Maghrebi Jews, and even if you were dealing with like Ethiopian Jews, you would see a very strong similarity where if you look at modern day movements that are really essentially trying to get away from the Torah, you wouldn't see a similarity between those groups. So what this means is if I take any, leader of any traditional Jewish community, either from the Middle East, Africa, or Asia, and place them next to, like, let's say, Orthodox rabbis, for example, or leaders from, from Europe, we'll see that for the most part, the basis of like what the Torah and Halakha is that it's the same in all these communities. The differences are mainly like localized traditions. But nobody, for example, is going to say something dramatically different about, let's say, the creator of all things, or dramatically different about how Shabbat is kept. And Shabbat is actually going to be the topic we're going to talk about in this video. Now, the reason for this similarity is very clear and very easy to say, is because all these different groups, come from, a same tradition, a traditional line of the giving the Torah at Mount Sinai that's been passed down through the oral Torah, through what's called the Masoreth, which is a passed down of tradition or of practice and also understanding that goes from generation to generation without break, meaning that all surviving Jewish communities to this day who can trace themselves through this line and are found within these kind of parameters which I've placed here for the most part, have a connection that all of their traditions can be traced back to. So when you look at a Torah scroll that's from Yemen versus a Torah scroll from Europe versus the Middle East, you're going to see the similarities in the text itself and how it's transcribed, because of the fact that the connection between all those communities goes back to certain points in history, where other groups, as I've talked about in other videos, have broken themselves off from, like, usually the ones we were talking about that were mentioned earlier, the Reform Conservative, were breakaways from the Orthodox or the traditional Jewish community of Europe that at one time existed. And of course, all of this comes from, the fact that the claim amongst all Torah-based Jews, whether it be Yemenite Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Ethiopian Jews, Asian Jews, African Jews, is that the Creator of all things gave the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, the written text, being exactly as the Creator wanted. But before that point, the Torah was given in all oral, meaning that constantly in the written text of the Torah it mentions that the Creator of all things, Hashem, said these things to Moses and did these things, and Moshe Rabbeinu said to the people of Israel these things. So the claim is that all of the concepts and ideas that can be considered Torath Mosheh, whether they be also the practices of how to actually do things from the Torah, all of those things and the ability to do them in a certain way, as well as the freedom to do them in localized interpretation, all of these things came from Hashem. And that's a common thread that exists amongst all ancient Jewish communities as compared to modern ones where people say, I don't believe that Hashem gave that. I don't believe that Hashem did this. I don't believe this and that, even though there's been thousands of years of Jews saying, no, this is the way it happened. So this, of course, goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the way that this Masorah worked, the way it was passed down throughout the generations, and that if you were to look back, you would say, okay, well, if I look at an Orthodox Jew in the modern time, I should be able to look at that and say, okay, I can find something in ancient Jewish history that matches what I see going on here, even if the clothing is a little bit different. At the most, I should be able to say that this passed on tradition continues, so that if a Jew 1,000 years ago was like, let's say, as we're going to talk about today, keeping Shabbat in a certain way, we would only find them doing it based, in ways that are similar to what you find amongst Orthodox Jews, as well as Yemenite Jews, Moroccan Jews. And for example, you wouldn't find similarities with what you would see in the Reform movement or the Conservative movement, for example. And of course, this goes back to the idea being that the basis of all Torath Mosheh communities, including Orthodox Jewish communities, is the written text of the Torah, which basically is almost like a cliff notes of the oral Torah to some degree, as well as the oral Torah being the explanation of how mitzvot were done and actually what was passed down to each generation to continue to pass down. And of course, as we mentioned before, within Orthodox Jewish communities, if we wanted to check and see throughout time exactly, what these traditions were and exactly how they were being practiced, we should be able to find them in traditional text. Now that's the easy part. There are people who would argue with that and say, okay, well, fine, you're looking in the Talmud. Of course, Orthodox Jews hold by what's in the Talmud, hold by what's in the Mishnah Torah, the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah, things like that, the Rabbasad Gaon, the Ramban, the Rosh, Rashi. Of course they do. But then the question we're going to deal with today is if we take one topic and determine whether or not Orthodox Jews are just simply perceiving themselves to be the correct way of doing things or perceiving themselves to be a continuation of it, if we look into the Tanakh without, the Talmud or anything like that, can we see a line of tradition that goes back to the times of the giving of the Torah and the Tanakh to Orthodox Jews of the modern era? So now let's start our example dealing with the Shabbat or the Sabbath. So now let's look at what the Torah says. One of the first statements that describes Shabbat in the Torah is in Sefer Shemot, also known as Exodus, specifically chapter, 16, 20, verse 26. And it says, Sheshet Yomim tilakatuhu uvayom hashiv'i Shabbat lo yiyebo. So this is a mitzvah that Hashem gave to the people of Am Yisrael, Bnei Israel, who were leaving Mitzrayim, and told them when He gave the mand, the bread that was considered from Min Hashemayim, from Hashem Himself, that they weren't supposed to collect it on Shabbat. That they basically, continuing in verse 29, says, "V'r'u ki Adonai naten lochem Shabbat, al leken hu noten lochem bayom hashishi lechem yomayim shovu ish tachto." Al yetze ish mekomo mimakomo bayom hashiv'i. So essentially, what this is saying, this is an interesting concept here. That first of all, they're being told not to go out and collect anything on the Shabbat, which something that's done even to this day amongst Torath Mosheh and Orthodox Jews. But also the fact that Hashem gave them this will give them double, the amount on Yom Shishi, which is on Friday, so that they don't have to even do it on Shabbat, and that they're not supposed to do it on Shabbat. So when it says Al Yitzei Ish Mimemakomo by Yom Shiv'i, this is a command not to do something. So this is an interesting parallel to people who nowadays try to say, well, you can do anything you want on Shabbat. It doesn't matter, what the Orthodox people say or whatever. Well, this is Hashem saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, tell Am Yisrael not to go out and do, this kind of searching on Shabbat. So this is a command not to do something. Lo ta'aseh, as we say in Hebrew. So this specifically says that there is a right way and a wrong way to do Shabbat. There are correct things and incorrect things. So if we continue in chapter 20, verse 7, This is from the Eseret Diburut, the Ten Commands, and this is specifically the words of Hashem directly to the entire nation of Am Yisrael, the entire nation of the people of Israel. And he says the following: Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho. So to remember the Shabbat and set apart. It says in the green, Sheshet Yamim da'avod v'asito kol malachtecho. So essentially, what it says in the green is that 6 days you'll do your avodah, do your work, and you'll do, your malacha. The malacha is considered to be a special type of work, almost like a creative type of work. But we'll define that a little bit more in just a second. And it says that 6 days out of the week you have to do those things. And it says in the next line after the green sections, and malachtecha, by the way, is in the red. And it says, B'yom hashiv'i shabbat l'Adonai Elohecho. It says on the seventh day, that is the Shabbat to Hashem, the creator of the creator of all things. Lo ta'aseh chol malacho ata uvinecho uvitecho u'avdecho u'amotecho uvhamtecho u'cherecho asher bishu'orecho. So starting in the yellow, it says in the first red words, it says Lo ta'aseh chol malacho. So it's like you will not do any of your work on the Shabbat. Only of your creative work, the malacha. So specifically this particular creative type of work is not to be done on Shabbat. And this is again from Hashem. And not the person that's being talked to, man or woman, if you will, not your sons, not your daughters, not your servants, not your animals, and not even people converted, not even people who are joining the Jewish people, but who have not converted. None of the people are supposed to be, forced to do malacha on Shabbat. Now, someone who's not Jewish, of course, can do malacha, but as a Jew, we can't tell them to do something for us on Shabbat. That's a sur, for example. So continuing, it says, Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim v'et haaretz at hayom v'et kol asher bom v'yonach bayom hashiv'i aleken berech Adonai et yom hashabbat v'kadeshehu. So essentially, this is giving the explanation that is connecting the Shabbat, as far as we as humans keep it, to the creative process that Hashem made, and then on the seventh part of the creation, that He basically allowed creation to go as it was, and didn't do any malacha towards that concept, if you will. Now, continuing in chapter 31, verse 12 of Shemoth of the book of Exodus, it says the following, and I highlighted the first part in red and green. It says, "Vayomer Adonai," meaning the Creator of all things said this, "El Moshe lemor," to Moshe. And he says, going further, "Va'ata daber al bnei Yisrael lemor," so you will speak to the bnei Yisrael to say, "Ach at Shabbotothai tishmoru." So Hashem says that my Shabbats they will keep. That you will keep, meaning plural, that all of you will keep. Ki od hi beni uvenechem ledorotechem loda'at ki ani Adonai mikadishchem. So it's a sign between Hashem and the people of Israel, meaning Shabbat is only for the people of Israel, and it's a sign between Him and us in all the generations, so that we would know that it's Hashem who makes us, kadosh, makes us separate, who separates us or makes us distinct amongst, if you will. So it continues, it says in the light blue, Ushmaratem et Shabbat ki kodashi lochem. So you will keep the Shabbat, you will guard the Shabbat. And it says, that's in the blue. And it says right after the blue, in red letters, Mahaleleho, to mean Mahaleho, means to break the Shabbat, to not keep a Shabbat, to do things that are considered forbidden on Shabbat. Moth yumoth. Now, moth yumoth, generally speaking, is usually translated as you will surely die. But essentially what it means is that a person would be separating themselves from the Creator of all things by choosing to willingly know that Hashem gave the Shabbat, know what's forbidden and what's permitted to do, and then say, I'm going to do this stuff anyway that's forbidden. So when the gray, it mentions, Ki kol ha'aseh voh malacho, v'nichurotho ha'nefesh hahi mekarev ameho. So this even goes further. The Creator says that by a Jew breaking Shabbat, by doing malacho on Shabbat, that it's like they're basically being cut off from their people. So this is, more of the better way of looking at it is that a person is separating themselves from the Jewish people by not keeping Shabbat the way that Hashem gave it, by doing specifically malacha. So it continues and says, after the great parts, Sheshet Yamim Ya'aseh Malacha. So for 6 days you do malacha. So Hashem is not saying don't do any kind of malacha. Just for 6 days you do malacha. Uvayom Hashivei Shabbat Shabbaton Kodesh Ladonai Kol Ha'aseh Malacha Bayom Hashabbat Muth Yomot. So twice this concept has been presented, that breaking the Shabbat by doing malacha on Shabbat is considered to be a sur, where the Creator of all things says that this person will surely die, and that it's as if this person has cut themselves off from their own people. by choosing to do this. And it'll be explained a little bit later what this actually means in a little bit more detail. And what it signifies for a Jew to say, I'm not going to keep Shabbat. Especially, and it's important to note that Yomoth Yomoth is generally speaking about someone who knows that Hashem gave the Shabbat, knows that Hashem exists and he gave the Torah, and then says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do what Hashem gave me. I'm going to separate myself from the people of Israel. When we deal with what the definition of malacha is in more detail, specifically from the Torah itself, we find in Shemoth, Exodus 31:1, the following, where it says in the very beginning on the right side, at the very top, in the green with the red letters, Vadaber Adonai El Moshe Lemor, which is, Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, Re'e korothi v'shem batzal el ben Uri ben Hur, b'matei Yehudah. So essentially it says that, Hashem called by name specifically on a particular individual whose name was Batzalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, who's from the tribe of Yehudah. And it says, Wa amale otho, ruach Elohim, chochmo uvithvono, uvada'at uvachol malacho. So to backtrack a little bit, what has happened here is that Moshe Rabbeinu has had, Hashem has described to Moshe Rabbeinu the building of the Mishkan, everything that's going to take to make the Mishkan. And basically he explains to, Moshe Rabbeinu that he's called a particular person by the name of Batzalel to be the one who would kind of lead this up, because he has a certain understanding that Hashem has already planned within him, has already given to him, whether that's also from things he's learned, things that he's actually investigated, and also from like firsthand knowledge that he's, actually, done by hand. And it says in terms of the part in the fourth line at the very right, it says Uvchol malacho, and it says all the malacho. So basically malacho is, we said, the kind of creative work. So it continues and says in the yellow, Lachshov Ma hashavot la'asot bazahov uvakasef uvanahoshath. So it describes several elements of malacha that are actually going to be done to make the Mishkan, make the tabernacle, as it's called in English. And it continues in green, uvaharoshath, aven lamalaoth, uvaharashath, uvaharoshath, eitz la'asot bechol malacho. So it continues in the green until the very end, where you see the very last letter words, the red words, that talks about more elements of building the Mishkan as well as the clothing for the Kohanim. That is called malacha. So this is where the understanding comes from, that when you talk about what is malacha, it's everything that it took to make the tabernacle and the Mishkan. So all the different elements of making that, whether it be goldsmithing, whether it be carving, moving things from different locations, whether it be, for example, sewing, everything that took to make the Mishkan is considered to be the top level of what's called malacha, and those things are forbidden on Shabbat for Jews to do. We put those things aside because we have 6 days to do them, and on the Shabbat we take a rest from doing all those things. And there's a number of halakhic texts to describe what malacha is, but the Torah specifically gives all these definitions when it describes in each part of the Torah what it takes to make the tabernacle. Those things are considered asur, and there are things that we develop and derive from those that throughout modern history, as time goes on, we understand, okay, in this modern era, now that we have like the use of electricity, industrial electricity, we know that there are things that are similar to what was used to do the Mishkan in this way. So the rulings are from our, leaders, that these things are in connection to those, and they're forbidden on Shabbat also. And see if the books of the Nevi'im, in the Ketuvim and the Tanakh, if we can find any idea of like how exactly Shabbat was supposed to be kept or not kept, and see if there's a connection between what was in the Torah, what we saw before, and what you see modern day Torath Mosheh or Orthodox Jews doing today. So if we look in the Navi, the prophet Yeshayahu, and look in 56 for 1, it says the following: Ko Omar Adonai. So this is Hashem speaking to the Navi. Shimru mishpat wa'asu tzavako. So he's like telling him to keep the the judgment, as well as the right path, or the correct path, if you will, tzedakah. Kikorov yeshuathi levo v'tzidkoti lehajaduth. So this part here is just kind of saying that Hashem's going to show something that's going to be relevant to the time that they're in. But it continues and says in the green, Ashrei enosh ya'aseh zot uven adam yachazik bo shomer shabbat me halalo. So essentially what Hashem tells the prophet here is, that the person, who keeps the Shabbat, the Jew, keeps the Shabbat, is, elevated in a certain sense. And, basically says that, keeping themselves from doing something that's bad, essentially saying that breaking Shabbat, doing mechalel Shabbat, is a bad thing. So this, of course, comes from Hashem to the prophet. So again, this is telling us there's a right way and the wrong way to do the Shabbat. It's not just simply everybody does whatever they want, and Hashem just gave it as for no reason whatsoever, without any kind of restrictions to it, even though the text says that there are. Um, and this is again from the Navi. So if we continue in Yeshayahu, in 58:13, it says the following: Im toshiv meshabot oreglecho asot hafsecha biyom kodashim. So it says, like, if you'll basically keep. It's like saying, essentially, one way to translate it is, if you keep the Shabbat the way Hashem gave it, and not do almost like the way your own thing, if you will. Hafsecha usually would be understood to mean that, like, for example, when I go to work, throughout the week, I basically work, 5 days out of the week. And the things I do there are not the kind of things I would on the Shabbat. So I wouldn't be doing, the engineering work that I do on Shabbat. In fact, I try to even talk about my job on Shabbat because, that's during the week. Why do I need to talk about it on Shabbat when I'm taking a break from that kind of process? So it continues, it says, "V'korotho the Shabbat oneg." So if you'll call the Shabbat, an oneg, meaning that almost like something that is enjoyable, that, you receive, a good spirited feeling from. So to like set apart, the Hashem, who's honored, meaning that Hashem gave the Shabbat, we honor Hashem by taking on this mitzvah that He gave us, of Shabbat. To basically honor, and by, from like, for example, doing the things that are a normal way during the rest of the week. So this is where the idea comes up of not talking about work-related items or non-Shabbat related items on Shabbat. So for example, there are Orthodox Jews who won't talk about, work at all on Shabbat because of this particular group of pasukim that explain it, but also from the oral Torah, because this is not mentioned in the written Torah. This is like all oral Torah right here that he's mentioning. So for example, there are Orthodox Jews who won't, involve themselves in TV, internet, things like that on Shabbat, or, anything that's like mundane from the rest of the week, because, Shabbat is a set apart time to enjoy, family, enjoy good meals, and enjoy resting, and enjoy the ability to learn Torah in a way that we can't do it during the week. There are some people who, for example, during the week are so busy that they don't have the ability to sit down and learn Torah and Halakha through most of the days of the week. But on Shabbat, we can take the time to be able to dig into areas of the Torah and Halakha that we may not be able to during the week. And it says, Oz tit anak Elonoi, v'hir chavticho, ala b'mothe, oretz, v'achalaticho, nachalat Yaakov avicho, ki Adonai diber. So essentially, what is interesting here is this is something that is actually said when we have like our meals on Shabbat. And even people who don't keep Shabbat, who actually will say what's called Kiddush, will actually mention these words. And it's interesting somebody would read it and not hold by it. Which to me, it'd make more sense if I didn't really believe in any of this stuff. I wouldn't even read it or recite it or even like understand it. I wouldn't even study it. It wouldn't make any sense to it. It didn't happen, and it makes no sense, especially if it didn't come from Hashem. Next part from the Tanakh, the next part of the Tanakh that we want to look at is from the book of Nehemiah. Now, what's important is a historical background. Nehemiah basically lived during a time where the people of Yehuda, the region of Yehuda, had been exiled at one point. The leadership had been exiled, and they returned to the land of Israel to reestablish the Torah and what they could from the previous generation that had been exiled. Now, when they came back, there were already, a lot of Yehudim, Jews who were still there, or Israelis who were still in that region, who were not part of the nobility or the leadership that hadn't been exiled. But he returned in order to try to like reestablish things. So one of the things that's interesting is near the end of Nehemiah, if we read a little bit going into chapter 50, 50, like I think 9, in the very beginning, it says, V'im ba'olom, ושבעו ללכת בתורת האלוהים אשר ניתנה ביד משה עבד האלוהים. So essentially, what is mentioning here is Nehemiah is mentioning that the base of the Torah of Hashem is what that they made a statement to keep that was given by the hands of Moshe Rabbeinu. So he's saying that Hashem gave the Torah. So this is a Navi a lot later saying this, that Hashem gave the Torah and that they were basically going to be keeping what Hashem gave in the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu. ולשמור ולעשות את כל מצוות אדוני אדוננו ומשפטיו והוגוב. So they would be keeping the Torah that Hashem gave, the mitzvot of Hashem. It's also the judgment and also the statutes. Now, it's important to note when some people try to tell you, okay, well, I only follow like the written Torah. I don't follow anything else. Okay, well, some things about to be mentioned here that are never mentioned in the written Torah, not specifically how they're written here. So essentially by, Nehemiah making this statement that they're going to be keeping the Torah as Hashem gave it, in the previous generations is going to be very important to what we're going to know now, whether or not, again, if we're saying that, Orthodox Jews in the modern time keep something different than what's in the Tanakh. So in the yellow it says, Lo asher lo nitan benothenu la'ameh ha'oretz wa'at benothahem lo nikach levonenu. So one of the things they mention is that they would not be like marrying with the, what they call Am Haaretz. Now there's several ways that a person can understand what Am Haaretz is. One way is to say that it's someone who really doesn't know the Torah or keep the Torah. Another way is like saying that there's someone who's like foreign to the people of Am Yisrael. So, again, that's kind of a, a little bit later issue. But if we keep going in the blue, it says the following: Wa'ameh ha'aretz hamvi'im et hamakohoth v'chol shever b'yom ha'shabbat limkor lo nikach mehem b'shabbat uvyom kodesh. So one of the things that Nehemiah is mentioning here is that the Am Haaretz, the people that he's being talked about here, who they were saying not to marry amongst them, they're saying that they're bringing things on Shabbat, especially doing things that are like, with merchandise and buying and selling. So essentially, like they're doing things on the Shabbat that he says is not making Shabbat not Kodesh, that are not done in Shabbat. Now that's not specifically mentioned in the Torah the way it's written here. There's no particular Torah that says Asur la'asot shever b'yom Shabbat. He's specifically saying that it is. So we'll continue and see what else he says about this. So going further, it says, "By Yamim Hahem Ra'iti Vihudo." So like Nehemiah says, in those days I saw, people in Yehuda, the region of Yehuda, or Judah, as people would say in English, Dorchim Jathot Bashabot Umvi'im Ha'rerimot Wa'olmasim Al Hachomorim Wa'af Yain Anovim Uth'enin V'chol Maso Umvi'im Yerushalayim B'Yom HaShabbat. So he says that he saw people like bringing in things, especially like stacking up things on top of like on mules and things like that, and bringing in like wine and different produce, and also like lifting things up and carrying things into Jerusalem, or at least attempting to on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat. It says, "Well, Eve biyom michorot sayid." So he's saying that they were doing all kind of things that were like dealing with trade, merchandise, and transporting things from one location to another, to bring it into Jerusalem. And it says, continuing outside of the yellow, in about the 1, 2, 3, fourth line, "V'hatzorim yoshevuvo mevi'im doch v'chol mecher." So he says that there were people like were sitting around, kind of like bringing in all kind of things to do with like like trade or things like that, if you want. Umochorim b'shabbat livnei Yehuda u'Yerushalayim. So it says that they were basically like buying things, selling things on Shabbat, in the region of Yehuda and Jerusalem. So he continues and says, outside of the two yellow sections, he says, "Wa'ariva et hore Yehuda, wa'omro lahem, ma hadavar hara hazeh asher atem osim." So he says that he started to like be in conflict with them. He started to kind of confront them, and says like to the people who are doing this, like like, hey, what are you doing? This is a bad thing that you're doing, altogether. It says halalim et yom Shabbat. So he says, he used the word mechalel that we saw earlier. He says that they're like basically, disregarding the Shabbat or doing what's forbidden on Shabbat. They're going against the mitzvot on Shabbat. And, there's all kind of ways you could say it, but essentially the word is like halelim Shabbat. It's like saying that they're breaking Shabbat, or making it into something ordinary like the rest of the week. And then he continues in the light blue. Says halocho alsu avotechem. And he's saying like this is something like your ancestors used to do. ויבא אלוהינו עלינו את כל הרעה הזאת ועל העיר הזאת, ואתם מוסיפים הרון על ישראל לחלל את השבת. So he says that everything that they were doing is basically bringing, it's our ancestors didn't do this, and the ones who did it essentially, brought upon the bad situation we're in where we were in exile. He says, and you guys are bringing that right now, it's like, if you will, angering, like, the creator of all things by, basically disregarding, what's we do and don't do on Shabbat. So this is a very strong indication. Okay, so we think about, okay, well, the Torah is very specific here, and the Tanakh is very specific, and the Nevi'im, they're very specific about how Shabbat was supposed to be kept. So this isn't just some like Orthodox Jew being like strict. And this is like the way that this is the Hashem gave the Torah, that there's supposed to be a certain ambiance on Shabbat that when not kept affects the Jewish people in a certain way. So in summary, if we go back to the original statement of the beginning of this video, and again we'll restate it. It's the person who made this comment said the following: Orthodox Jews are those Jews who perceive themselves to be the authentic continuation of Jewish tradition, as opposed to Reform and conservative movements, which are considered by them to be deviants. They, Orthodox Jews, are the most traditional amongst the Jews and espouse strict adherence to the law. So we've looked at this and we've said, okay, we could look at this and say, okay, well, Orthodox Jews is not, perceiving themselves to be, the authentic continuation of Jewish tradition. They're doing exactly what Hashem told Am Yisrael to do, in terms of having the judges, keeping the Shabbat. In this particular issue, we've seen that, Shabbat is defined a certain way, not to do Malacha. We said we know that Orthodox Jews don't look to do Malacha on Shabbat. We know that Orthodox Jews stay away from doing Malacha on Shabbat. And we know that on the opposite side, there are people who look for ways to break Shabbat as much as they can. So someone says, okay, well, I don't live near, a synagogue, so I have to drive on Shabbat. Well, the Orthodox Jew will look and say, I'm going to move close to the synagogue so I don't have to drive on Shabbat, and I won't do those things because they're a sur on Shabbat. There are people who look for ways to say, okay, well, maybe if I do this or this is the circumstances particularly permitted for me to do this on Shabbat. Orthodox Jew looks and says, no, I'm going to keep Shabbat the way Hashem gave it, not the way I'm going to make it for myself or to try to get out of doing it, to try to look like the nations, to do something different than what Hashem gave. We saw earlier that this is given to make the people of Israel different from the rest of the world because it was given to the people of Israel. And when someone tries to deviate from it or find ways to deviate from it outside of saving someone's life, because anytime it's a matter of saving someone's life, we're required to put aside certain things on Shabbat in order to save that person's life if they're going to die on Shabbat or right after Shabbat. That's considered to be a commandment to save their life. And then as soon as we've saved their lives, we go back to keeping the Shabbat the way that the way the Torah tells us to do it. So again, as we said before, the Jews who keep the Torah, Torath Mosheh Jews as well as Orthodox Jews, are simply continuing the process that existed amongst the entire Am Yisrael, the people of Am Yisrael, from the time the Torah was given to the modern era. It's not some new thing that just popped up, and Orthodox Jews are just being strict on something that nobody else was keeping in a certain way. You can't be strict on something that people do normally. It'd be like saying, I'm strictly walking down the street. No, I'm walking down the street. It's just a normal thing. Someone can't say, well, you're strictly doing your work at work. Well, no, I'm doing the work that's required of me the way it's the work that says it's supposed to be done, the way the job says it's supposed to be done. My managers, have a certain way that things say that business is supposed to be done. That's the way I do it. It isn't something special or strict. And I don't have to say I believe I'm being an engineer by doing engineering. I'm actually doing engineering before I am an engineer. It's not a matter where I perceive or believe that I'm supposedly doing something a certain way. So again, that's one of the reasons why when we look at, around the Jewish world of ancient Jewish communities, meaning Jewish communities that precede, I would say about 500 years ago, and we look around the Jewish world, we see a commonality. Now, if you look at the bottom right two pictures, for example, those are two rabbis who are Ethiopian Jews. Now, one of the things that sometimes people pull out and say, well, the Ethiopian Jews didn't have the oral Torah. Anyone who knows Ethiopian Jewish cultures know they 100% did. There's actually several texts that they had that are very, if you will, using the word used in the original post, strict about how Shabbat is kept. The idea of having things not to be used on Shabbat, Ethiopian Jews had that. The idea of not doing business on Shabbat, the Ethiopians had that too. In every Jewish community, you see a commonality between the ancient communities who were looking to do the will of Hashem versus the modern kind of, if you will, movements that started up to try to get away from doing the will of Hashem, or saying that Hashem doesn't exist or that Hashem didn't even give the Torah. Someone who says, I know that Hashem gave the Torah and I'm going to do the will of Hashem because I love Hashem and I love the mitzvot he gave, will look for ways to do it rather than ways of getting out of it, for example.